Calvin, welcome, bro. So happy you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, dude. I gotta say it's a first for me. I'm happy we're able to find a time to record, but yeah, it's sitting over here 5 a.m. my time. I know 8 a.m. Sunday is not any better at all. This is what we got to do, and I'm more than excited to kind of have a discussion with you today. And yeah, I'm grateful we got to at least find a time that works for both of our schedules. So thanks for spending a little bit of time with me this morning, dude.
Absolutely. I didn't even realize it was so early over there.
Nah, dude, honestly, it's fun. It's just pitch black outside. Just kind of how I like it, honestly. Dude, you've been someone that I've followed for I honestly don't remember the first time I followed you. I think it was after your article last year in the Alan Aragon Research Review. I've heard a few podcasts I think that you've been featured on. One being My Fellow Coaches and Friends, Jordan Lips. That was a phenomenal episode that I'm drawing inspiration from a lot of the topics that we might talk about today. But dude, you've been somebody who I've been really impressed with and have learned a lot from. And I remember reading, yeah, The Science of Appetite Regulation or The Fascinating Physiology of Appetite Regulation, whatever that article was last year that you wrote. And remember thinking like, damn, I feel like I just learned more in my, like it took me a couple of days to read it because it was pretty long, but I remember reading that and being like, damn, I just learned more reading this paper from this 18, 19-year-old than like my, 4 week kind of lectures on this stuff in my anatomy and physiology course when I was in my undergrad, or even like my human nutrition kind of metabolism class, capstone class in college. And I don't know what it was about it, but you were able to connect so many dots together. And I think it's hard to do that with such complex topics. And anybody that can do that, it's just something that I really appreciate. And it's really hard to synthesize and to be able to communicate that information accurately, but also, digestibly for, their audience. I know that's not necessarily meant for the lay public. So I'm reading it with a little bit of a different lens than somebody, off the street who's learning to learn a little bit more. But I remember just reading that article and following you on Instagram ever since. And it's been fun to see your evolution over even the last 6 to 9 months, let alone the last, year or so. So, just wanted to say, dude, thank you for all you've done in the space. And I know nutrition isn't even your first, kind of your first job, I guess you could say. If you look at your totality of hours spent doing shit towards the week. So I've just been really impressed and I've enjoyed learning from you. And I just wanted to give you your flowers here to start this podcast because it was something that has really helped me and it's something that I'm excited to talk about today. So with all that being said, dude, tell me about you. Tell me about backstory. Give your little podcast intro, and we can kind of go from there. But for the people who don't know you, and I'm guessing most of my listeners probably don't, and not in a bad way, but just like when I remember stumbling across your stuff, I was like, damn, who is this kid? And it was just refreshing to see that. But who would you or how would you describe who Calvin Scheller is to somebody who's never heard of you before?
All right. Yeah, that's a good one. To start, right now I'm 19, but I kind of got into this space around 17. So I started creating content when I was 17, and I wrote my first article for Alan when I was 17. Um, to be honest, it was a lot at 17. I didn't quite know what I was doing. I got some attention quick, not a lot of attention. I'm still growing all my social medias, but I got some attention, which was more than I had prior to. So it was as soon as I got that, I tried to lean into it and just create as much content as possible. So if you go through my social medias, there's probably weeks of content that you could look through. Um, and I try and be on effectively as many podcasts and write as many articles as possible just to contribute to the space as I can. Um, but it all started, I guess you could say that, when I was about 15. So when I was 15, I got really sick. Again, we're not entirely sure what all happened, but I know that the worst part was that for about 2 months I couldn't eat. I ate probably about two meals in the course of 2 months, and ended up in the hospital for the following 2 months. So in that 2 months where I couldn't eat, I lost about 60 pounds. I didn't know what was going on. No one could tell me what was going on, and I didn't like that. So I was like, I'm going to figure this out. I didn't end up technically figuring out exactly what happened, just because by the time I gathered the information I needed to gather, we weren't in the state to run the test that I would have wanted to run. But I'll say that it kind of just sparked this passion for human physiology that kind of has been burning ever since. So um, I think for the past 4 or 5 years, you can say that the majority of my free time is spent learning, creating content. But in the past year or two, the amount of free time that I have has gone down radically. So as you mentioned, I do currently do a lot more than just the online social media space. So right now, let me just count it for a second. I work 3 jobs. Um, so typically each week's, it's pretty high up there in hours, usually 100, 110 hours, which is something that I do because this year, at, as soon as I stopped going to school, I moved out and bought my first house. So that was a big stepping stone in my life. So right now, the work is going to steadily decrease, and time spent on social media is going to steadily increase over the next year or two. But my full time job, I'm effectively an engineer. I'm kind of an engineering assistant. And then now that I've been with the company I'm at for a year, the idea is to go back to school as an engineer and then become a full-time engineer. So that's the plan. But there's a lot of opportunity in social media to quit all jobs and spend everything I got on it. So that's the hope. But we kind of, I balance everything. I think I balance it okay, but onlookers might say differently. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. Is I kind of got into the space after getting sick, like a lot of people tend to do. And nowadays, I'm just kind of giving it all I got, but also I've got a life outside of social media, if that makes sense.
Yeah, as we all should. The people who do not have life outside of social media are the people you should probably worry about a little bit. But tell me about the resolution, and if there was any resolution from the time where, hey, something's not right, you got sick, not eating, lost a ton of weight, got kind of into the nutrition space. What kind of issues were you dealing with? That was the digestive stuff. Was there things that a provider helped you through? Was it all self exploration and stuff that you figured out on your own? Like, what was that experience like? And do you still struggle with some of those things today, or have you been able to kind of get into a routine where those things don't bother you as much?
I'll say, unfortunately, from a provider sense, I didn't really get much help. It was a lot of like, we don't really know what's going on, so stay in this hospital bed until you get better or we figure it out. So after I was able to eat 3 solid meals a day, they kind of released me without much information on where to go. But after I came out of the hospital, I did realize that a lot of the foods that I typically ate gave me some pretty bad digestive upset. So those foods I couldn't really hold down, and so my diet pretty much went to bare bones minimum. So it was fruits, vegetables, and certain vegetables. I didn't tolerate all vegetables, and then kind of just your normal proteins. And it was at that point it was tough to gain weight back, not because I didn't have the appetite for it or didn't know what had calories in it or not, but simply because I couldn't hold down much more than 2,500 calories in a day. So it took about a year for in kind of living normal life in a very kind of unhappy diet in a sense, and kind of staying around the same weight. And I'll say over the past 6 months, I gradually got to reintroduce foods after that kind of year. I was eating very similar foods, and the past 6 months they've been very enjoyable in the sense that I've reintroduced foods that I didn't think I'd get to eat again. And nowadays, I get to eat effectively whatever I want. And it's nice because in the past 6 months, I've also been able to tolerate and hold down more and more food and more calories. So I'm at the point where I've put on about 35 to 40 pounds in the past, call it 9 months, which might sound like a lot, but mind you, when I got out of the hospital, or let's say 9 months ago, I was 5'8", about 107, 108 pounds. So I was very, very thin, at an unhealthy level. And then muscle mass was down to the minimum level. But over the past, again, 9 months, I think I've gotten stronger than I've ever been, and I feel definitely healthier than I've ever been. And I get to enjoy food just like everyone else again, which is nice. So it was effectively kind of just a trial and error game, which on my part was kind of enjoyable because it's kind of with my brain, it's kind of something that I enjoy. But it was trial and error, and I think everything's gotten into a very good groove lately.
That's awesome, dude. I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, you hear similar experiences, not exactly your situation where you're hospitalized or you kind of had these kind of extremes happen to you, but people just struggling digestively or with their nutrition or even with their weight loss. And ideally getting them to a place, or people finding a routine and a lifestyle and a diet and, all these things that can kind of be a little bit more sustainable for them, or, make the puzzle pieces fit for them in their life with their needs and with their goals and the things that are really important to them. It's fun to see that happen. Whether you're helping coach somebody through that or not, it's nice to hear those stories instead of feeling like people are, 18, 19 years old and fucked up and they keep that same, kind of path for the next 10 years. Like, you see that happen as well, but it's nice that you've been able to kind of come to the other side. You mentioned a lot of the weight gain, lean mass gain over the last 6 to 9 months as well. Tell me just a little bit about like getting into the gym. Is that something that you've done for the first time, or were you lifting before you got sick? And how has that experience been for you? Just kind of like introducing that into your routine and feeling good enough to actually commit to that each week.
Yeah, so I lifted probably 5 to 6 days a week before I got sick. So I played sports, and I enjoyed lifting. I still do. And then when I got sick, I got to the point where kind of just getting up, getting into the car, and going to the gym. That process felt like it, took all the energy out of me. Just at that point, because of how effectively you could say how malnourished I was. Um, Even little things, they felt like they took loads of effort and almost all my energy away from me. So I didn't go to the gym for about probably 5 to 6 months, and I got back into the gym. Still was having trouble dietarily, just keeping down enough calories. And then but again, still lifting. And then luckily, again, as we began to reintroduce things, it sounds weird, but there was no tipping point. It kind of just was a gradual increase in calories, increase in the variety of foods that I could consume. And I'm at the point today where I don't really have a worry about it anymore. I can eat effectively whatever I want. I don't necessarily eat as much as I want. I still have to monitor things, but I eat quite a bit more than I used to be able to. And as that weight started coming back, that energy started coming back as well. So I've probably been lifting consistently for about a year and a few months, maybe a year and 2 months. But then with the dietary front, been able to actually add in calories to see any progress in the gym. Probably about the past 9 months. And like I said, I'm stronger than I've probably ever been, which is it's a nice feeling to have. But nowadays I do lift 6 to 7 days a week, not necessarily um, long intensive lifts. So with my work schedule, getting in 25 to 30 minute lifts 7 days a week is easier than getting in, 4 2-hour sessions. It just I would like to sleep on certain days, so I don't end up getting in those super long sessions, but I do try and get in um, more sessions throughout the week. So I might get in 6 and sometimes even 7, depending on how my schedule looks like for the week. 25 to 30 minute sessions, and every once in a while, I'll go in and it might be again the seventh day of the week, and I'll go in and that session isn't crazy. Sometimes it might just be stretching and 1 to 2 movements that I want to work on personally. Um, Typically, it's some sort of like calisthenics movement, like dips or pull-ups, something like that. And then kind of just call it good for the day. But I'm lucky because I work at a gym, and the gym's about 5 minutes from my house, so it's not too intensive of a task to get there.
For sure, dude. Yeah. And as we kind of transition into some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, and the first question I'm going to ask you, I'm just curious from like an anecdotal experience on your end, since you've started to get into the gym, like what impacts have you noticed exercise have, even on your own personal like appetite regulation and your desire to eat? Is that something that you have found is like um, been a domino that was set in place? And once you figured out nutrition stuff and your diet, and symptomatically you feel better, don't have any, these, big disruptions in your day and in your weeks, that's been something that's been easier to execute? Or have you felt like exercise has been an important part of that recovery process for you that's played out in ways that maybe you couldn't have gotten from elsewhere, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I'd say exercise is kind of like you said, it's something that was set in place prior to actually being able to dial in my nutrition. So effectively, as soon as my nutrition was able to get to where it needed to be, I was seeing the effects that exercise should have been having, or would have had if I had adequate nutrition. So it was kind of something that's been there. And as my dietary habits got set in stone, I finally see the progress from the gym. When it comes to my appetite, I think I'm one of I don't know. Some people are very different. Some people prefer large meals prior to the gym. I prefer not to have a super full stomach prior to going to the gym. I'll typically have something. So in my case, typically I work one shift, go to the gym for 30 minutes, and then go to the next shift. That next shift is usually at the gym, so I just shower, clock in. Um, but so I typically will work out like in between two shifts. So I'll try and have a larger meal about midway through the first shift, and then I won't eat until after I work out that second shift, or after I work out into that second shift. But I will say that exercise does make me fairly hungry. I do tend to give it about 30 to 35 minutes before I eat. I'm not too worried about the anabolic window, but for me, it's a big thing that I like to at least get into a state where I'm not as amped up from the exercise session. I'm kind of relaxed a little bit, and then I'll try and have that meal. Just so, I mean, in certain cases, you'll eat to the point where you'll eat too fast, and then you'll realize that you're a lot more full than you thought you were, just because you're kind of. It sounds obscure, but you're kind of amped up. So you eat faster and you do everything a little bit faster, and then you kind of can't really take note of where you're at. So I try and get everything set up, get ready for a meal in a sense, and then eat. So that's for me. But I am fairly hungry. That's probably the hungriest time of the day for me is right after I work out.
For sure, dude. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's kind of fun to hear other people's personal experience, especially for you somebody who's a very high performer who has a lot of demands throughout the course of the week where eating is maybe a little bit more forced in certain parts of your day. And it's, a little bit more difficult to just sit down and have a meal uninterrupted, no distractions, and just like doing your own thing for 15, 20 minutes at a time. Like it doesn't happen very often. And I find that even like working with clients, there is a lot of trial and error associated with just like figuring out what is going to work for you throughout the course of the day. And I think this is where like, yeah, maybe on paper, what might be optimal is really not, super practical. And like, we have to be able to be flexible and appreciate the fact that, yeah, hey, even imperfect, additions to eating and style of foods and preparation and leaning on prepackaged process stuff, God forbid, right? Like those stuff can and should be part of somebody's routine if, there's, schedule is kind of demanding that. And I think there's ways working around that and ways that we can make that better. But, when it comes to meal timing, I think some people are just forced into whatever their schedule looks like for the day. But even within that context, there's still a lot of like nutrition interventions that you might be able to find and implement that could be really helpful for you still. But it's just helpful hearing you walk through that process for yourself because I want people to appreciate the fact that like most of the time, if not every time you eat, throughout the course of the week, it's not going to be this perfect what I eat in a day influencer BS type of video where it's like they've had time to cook for 2 hours and clean for an hour throughout the course of the day. And every meal is handmade and they have all these different colors. It's like, no, motherfucker, like two Chobani completes and a perfect bar for breakfast might be all we are able to get. And that might be good enough for now. So I just find that funny and fascinating, but from real world applicability, man, there's so many ways that, a food, type of landscape might look for somebody day to day, man.
I will say that my experience with how my appetite changes after working out might be different from other people. There's some data behind why it might be, but some people find that they're not very hungry after the workout, and some people find that they're fairly hungry. And again, this isn't conclusive, and it's not the only reason, but there is some data behind. So when we exercise, we produce a molecule called lactate, and lactate can have a slight appetite suppressive effect. Certain people just genetically produce more or less lactate, and depending on how long you've been working out, what type of exercises you've been doing, you'll produce more or less lactate. And with that, it also depends on the intensity of the exercise. A lot of people find that after very intense exercise, their appetite is a lot lower than after kind of like a long duration, low intensity exercise, or just kind of your average weightlifting. So there are some reasons why certain people may be more or less hungry after their exercise session. Some people might be ravenous, and some people might not want to eat for another hour, kind of until that lactate begins to get recycled and things of the like. So there is some reasons why my experience might not be the same as your experience. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're not super hungry after the gym, it didn't mean you didn't work out hard enough. As a matter of fact, it might mean you worked out harder than I did. But if you're not super ravenous after the gym, there's nothing wrong with waiting a little bit before eating, kind of until that appetite system kind of comes back to baseline, I guess we could say.
For sure, dude. Yeah. And I love that caveat here. And yeah, again, that's why I wanted to get you on the podcast is you're very thorough in the best way. And I think you kind of have to be with a lot of the, complex discussions and intricacies of all these factors that kind of go into one another. And this kind of transitions us into this first question I'm going to ask you, and kind of how I'm envisioning this podcast going today is I want to just talk very broadly for a second around what are some of the things, whether it's an environment, a genetic, social, we just talked about exercise for a little bit. Like, what other factors, what other things are out there that can influence what we eat or how much we eat or what our experience with food looks like? Because I think what I'd like to do is acknowledge that there's a lot of things that exist and then hone in on just one of those components, which is, again, what I think is some of your bread and butter as of recent, which is just genetics and the physiology around appetite regulation from a human standpoint and an individual standpoint. So I think we spend a lot of our discussion around there today. But what else is out there? Because I think this is an important little concept for people to appreciate here, because most of my listeners, to be honest, are not going to be people sitting here trying to geek out, learn every single thing. And I hope we do that today. But I want people to take away the fact that this is and can be very complicated. And we'll do our best to simplify and come up with big generalizations and things that people can take away from just like a learning standpoint, this podcast. But I think, and again, not to overwhelm people either. I think there's kind of this trend in the space sometimes where it's like more information is always better for people. And I personally, having experienced coaching clients and being in the space the last 4 or 5 years, like I find that to be, the opposite to be true in a sense, where it's like, hey, having a little bit more of a minimalist mentality or understanding the basics and really honing in on the big rocks like energy balance and macronutrient, consumption, whether we're tracking macros or not, hydration, sleep, stress management, seeing a therapist, lifting, exercising, getting our steps in, like all the stuff that we need to do to get the biggest return on our investment instead of, I had, Alan Aragon, who you've worked with and has kind of hired you to do these articles, but we talked about micromanaging blood sugars and seed oils and, like good or bad foods and this whole flexible dieting approach. And I think there's so much of a tendency for people to really just hone in on these really complex topics, thinking they need to know everything in the science and the nuance around all of this stuff in order to be healthy. And again, I just find that not to be the case, especially for non-nutrition, like career people and just the general public. It's like, what can we help people get to get the most bang for their buck without, hyper focusing or being overly neurotic without around everything they do with their nutrition. And so I add this context here because I know we're going to get into the weeds with a handful of things, but if somebody could just sit here and take away the fact that there's a lot of things at play here and just appreciate the fact that those exist, I think that can kind of help, give people permission to start thinking like, oh yeah, my genetics and my hunger and my drive and my decisions and what I put into my body, all of those things should and need to be individualized to me. And when you hear Gary Brecka or fucking Flav City out here saying everybody should be doing this one thing, it's like, yeah, you can almost weed through the BS a little bit more, having a little bit more knowledge on the subject and appreciating how a lot of, stuff you see in the nutrition space is not, overly generalizable to every single person that a lot of people approach talking with, at least in the space. So with that being said, like, what are some factors that can drive people to eat? Curious, like where your head goes, or if there's buckets that you might acknowledge if you're talking to somebody, if we're just kind of setting the scene today, and just kind of how that plays into one another.
Yeah, there's a lot there, as you kind of mentioned.
Take what you
Well,
want with that. Sorry about that. I'm really good at just giving a lot of information and then just like leaving the guests with like, yeah, however you want to take that, just go from there. But
no, I think that's important. So I guess we could take a step back and say that there are certain people that just at baseline, kind of almost from birth, have larger appetites than their counterparts. There are a lot of genetic factors that might dictate whether or not you or I have a larger appetite. Um, and that includes things such as, effectively, the biggest things end up being the hormones we produce and the receptors that those hormones bind to, the amount of those hormones that we produce, and how sensitive those receptors are. So a lot of people genetically may have smaller or larger appetites simply because genetically they might produce more or less of those appetite stimulating and appetite suppressing hormones. So that's a big thing where, you know, some people will say that, they were born overweight. It's not necessarily that, but they might have factors that, when in the right environment, lead them to become overweight because their appetite is larger, and with food availability, they will eat more food than their counterparts. With that, food availability becomes a very important thing. Um, it's very hard to eat to appetite when you don't have food in your immediate surroundings. And what food is in your immediate surroundings might dictate what foods you have an appetite for, or what foods you're driven to consume. So that's also a very important thing, that your environment does play a role in, one, how often do you eat fully to appetite? Certain cultures, eating fully to appetite isn't necessarily normal. In certain cultures, eating to about 80 to 90% fullness is the norm and is what is taught to the younger generation. In other cultures, eating to and beyond fullness is also becoming the norm. Um, so that's an important thing, your environment, and then what food you have in your environment. If there's a multitude of, let's say your countertop is full of fresh fruits and vegetables that you can eat raw, or if your countertop is full of multitude of higher caloric snacks, that will dictate what you have an appetite for or what you're driven to consume. Because the easiest option is typically the option that you're going to choose. And then once you choose it once, the idea of choosing it again becomes more and more poignant. So that's a big thing, is our environment will dictate, again, what we eat, and then how much, kind of almost how we're taught to eat in a sense. And then when it comes to probably what might be more important for a lot of people, is what is driving you to eat right now and what can you do about it? So typically the things that are driving you to eat right now comes down to effectively what you've done over the course of the day, including your sleep, exercise, your stress, and then what have you consumed over the course of the day, whether you've consumed breakfast, what was in that breakfast. So let's say if I started my day off with a very tough workout, poor sleep, um, lots of stress, and I effectively had no breakfast. When it comes down to around lunchtime, I would probably be extremely ravenous. Whereas if you started your day off with a great night of sleep, a lower intensity exercise session, and fairly unstressed, and your breakfast consisted of a higher protein meal with lots of fibrous carbohydrates, when it comes down to lunch, you could go for lunch. You might not even want lunch. You might want to wait a few hours. But for me, I have to eat lunch or I'm going to go crazy. So just those things right there, those few factors can dictate how hungry you are at the next meal, and how hungry when you're sitting at your desk doing work, or a lot of people do manual labor when you're doing your job. How hungry you are while you're doing your work, and how much food is on your mind while you're doing your work. So I think the biggest levers for most people are what you're doing over the course of the day, that will dictate what you decide to eat over the course of the day, and how hungry you are over the course of the day.
Yeah, well said, dude. Well said. And I think the environment is so interesting to me. And that's probably the part that's going to be, most relevant to the person listening to this podcast, where it's just like, yeah, like what did you grow up knowing, or what did your parents do? And where do you live today? And not to say that all of these are like modifiable risk factors. A lot of them aren't, especially when we talk about the genetic component of a lot of this stuff. But the environment in which you live in, and people you surround yourself with, and the foods that you buy, and the foods you have access to, and how much resources you have to spend on those things, like that is something that, again, maybe we'll have a part two of this discussion, because even me saying this out loud, I realize how important that is compared to even the genetic component as well. I think we've all kind of heard that saying where it's like genetics load the gun and then your environment pulls a trigger or whatever, which I think is kind of cheesy and maybe has some flaws to a certain extent with it as well, but it can be true. And again, I think that, in addition to like human psychology and the interplay of those together, in addition to your genetics, is very interesting. Of like, yeah, we have everything. You have the environment, and then you have your genetic predisposition to some of this stuff. And then you have your psychology, where it's like, somebody who maybe grows up thinking about dieting on and off with their parents, through their adolescent years and their early years. And, they go to college and they join a sorority, and all these body image stuff, continue to present. It's like, yeah, you get to mid 20s, early 30s, you have all these life experiences of you always trying to like flip on and off this this dieting switch, or having body image or body dysmorphia stuff, or always wanting something that you don't have, and like how that factors into this equation, like the desire and, you know, the decisions that you make around food, independent of the environment that you live in and what you have, you know, immediate access to. I find also very fascinating. And again, oftentimes what we do as coaches as well is like addressing some of those insecurities and past experiences and helping people appreciate how that is influencing their decisions. In addition to somebody who, again, yeah, somebody might be doing this and they're predisposed to being 5-10% hungrier on average than somebody else in their same position, right? So I think you know, thinking about all these things together, it can be kind of stressful and overwhelming. And I want to simplify it a little bit and kind of go in the direction of like, you know, again, genetic predisposition and what's going on at a physiology level. But I think, yeah, starting with this idea that, hey, environment and your psychology and your current routine and your previous beliefs and your goals, like all of that shit really shapes how we eat, how much we eat, and our relationship with eating and the foods that we eat as well. So if you have any 2 cents on that, great. If not, I'm going to ask you what appetite is in general.
Oh, that was really well said.
What is appetite, bro? Like if you had to sit here and define it, and I remember reading that definition, and to be honest, I've never thought of a definition of appetite. My perception of it has always been like, oh yeah, you know what, your stomach growls or you feel like a little empty inside, and it's like, oh, maybe that is my inclination to eat. You know, like that's something that that's something is that what drives appetite. But is there more to that, or how would you sit here and describe what appetite is? Because it's not necessarily just the consumption of food, is it?
Yeah, so again, I've always had trouble defining appetite, but for me, the best definition I've come to is the desire to consume. And appetite, as you mentioned, isn't necessarily just for food. Appetite can be for a multitude of different things. Certain people might have an appetite for nicotine, if that's something that you engage in, or alcohol. You might have an appetite for alcohol. Um, if you're anything like me on a super long day, I kind of have an appetite for caffeine every once in a while. Just appetite isn't necessarily the desire to consume food, but it's the desire to consume something. And sometimes you can use the word appetite to describe things that have no relation to the consumption through your mouth. It could be, you have an appetite to achieve something or something of the like, but it's just the desire to consume. And for me, the biggest thing that people don't think about when it comes to appetite, at least that I've seen, is that appetite doesn't necessarily mean you're hungry to just eat any food. It can be you have an appetite for specific foods. And when it comes to appetite, you and I might have different appetites for different foods. So my appetite might dictate that I want to go eat. Let's say we're sat down at a buffet. My appetite might dictate that I eat 5,000 calories worth of broccoli, and yours might dictate that you eat 5,000 calories worth of steak. Um, so there are differences in appetite, and those differences typically come um, potentially from what you're currently lacking. So if you've just consumed 400 grams of protein in the day, you're probably not going to have a huge appetite to go consume more protein. Some people might, that's completely up to you, but you're probably not going to have a huge appetite for protein. Um, Whereas if you haven't had much protein throughout the day, you might have a specific appetite for protein. But in a much more, if we take a step back and we look at a broader picture, what I have an appetite for is also dictated by what I've consumed in the past. Um, so if I've repeatedly consumed certain things when I'm very hungry, I might have an appetite for those specific things when I get very hungry. And for some people, those things end up being things like packaged foods or foods that they wouldn't necessarily say contribute to their overall goal. Whereas other people, some people, if you look at, I've heard this said, not that I um, say that the carnivore diet is something that people should try, but I've heard this from people who do the carnivore diet that when they get really hungry, all they want to eat is steak and eggs. Um, and that's, again, that's kind of just a representation that appetite for me might be much different than appetite for you in the sense that I might want to eat different things and how much I want to eat. So some people almost the way that they've grown up, that their appetite, when they say they're super hungry, they still don't eat to complete fullness. It's just kind of a habit. Whereas other people, when they say they're hungry, if they get to the point where they are hungry, they might eat to and beyond fullness in the sense that they are at the point where they are overly full. So that's also a very big factor. But appetite in itself is the desire to consume, but there's so many broad categories outside of that that might dictate what is consumed, how much is consumed, and where it's consumed.
Yeah, dude, well said. And I can't help but think that like, you know, what you're introduced to early on in life has a huge role and big influence on a lot of the stuff. Even from my own personal experience, I really, resonate with that sentiment a lot. And even, with working with a lot of people and even everything you just said, where it's just like, yeah, a lot of it starts very early. And I've been super interested and fascinated with like even what happens in the womb, like when we're talking about that early on, just because my wife and I are expecting a little girl here in this next month or so. And just like diving into like a little bit of that research and what supplements you should be taking. And I've dabbled in and just seen some, and it's honestly impossible to study, but just like how what mothers eat in the womb can influence what the child's palate might be later on in life, and just some interesting stuff like that. But again, this stuff happens before we can even remember things, honestly, quite frankly. And also just like these past experiences and these lived experiences that people have growing up, I find play such a pivotal role in like what their preferences are. And it's like, oh yeah, you have a family and you grew up eating just like ribeye steaks all the time as a kid. And now there's people glamorizing this as a diet and a lifestyle online. It's like, yeah, I might be more inclined to, gravitate towards that. Whereas for me growing up, it's like my mom had a vegetable every single dinner we had, and hammering asparagus 2-3 times a week was not abnormal. And I still do that today. It's like all of these things can kind of shape, who we are, what we do, and how we think about food and what our appetite is for things later on in life. And where does that appetite come from, I guess? And I kind of want this to be a leading question of like, is it a brain chemistry thing? Is it specifically coming from the hypothalamus? Are there other components of the brain at play here? But like, when it comes to appetite regulation, how would we start to go about describing like where that comes from and how we think about that? And we can kind of go from there.
Yeah. So I'll say, if we think about, let's say, let's talk about this. So, after I eat, I'm not very hungry. And then after I've spent 3 or 4 hours not eating, I begin to get hungry again. That process itself is driven mostly by hormones that are produced inside the gastrointestinal tract and inside the brain. There are other hormones that play effect, such as insulin, which is produced by the pancreas. So there's, let's say, the milieu of hormones is more complicated for a 1 hour podcast. But we'll say there's a milieu of hormones that are produced after the consumption of food that drive us to stop consuming food. And then after we've consumed, or after we haven't consumed food for 3 to 4 hours, there's another milieu of hormones that will kick in, and the milieu of hormones that were produced after we ate will begin to decrease. So we could say there's a different milieu before or after eating, and then before eating when you are super hungry, that will dictate whether or not you have the desire to consume. A lot of those hormones, again, are produced in the gastrointestinal tract in response to food intake. So we'll consume food, and just the process of our stomach distending will send signals to the brain to stop eating. And then after eating, there's a period of time where we feel quite satiated or we don't want to continue eating. And that's typically because of the milieu of hormones that are produced inside of the gut. And those hormones will feed back to receptors inside the brain that indicate effectively, if we look at it almost like an evolutionary sense, that there's energy inside of the gut, and there's nutrients inside of the gut that we can use to expend. And then there's also hormones that are produced directly in the brain, again, in response to stomach distension and in response to those hormones being produced in the gastrointestinal tract, that again will decrease our appetite. So we can think of hormones as anorexigenic or orexigenic. I think anorexigenic are hormones that decrease appetite, and orexigenic are hormones that increase appetite. After eating, we have a milieu of anorexigenic hormones that are produced. And after we haven't consumed food for a prolonged period of time, the amount of those hormones is reduced and the amount of the orexigenic hormones that are produced is increased.
Just I found myself just nodding along there because when I think of like trends on social media and even just like people that promote different styles of coaching, and hormone balance and hormone regulation is a huge one. And again, usually people are talking about that in the context of like male or female, mostly female, like reproductive hormone health and things like that. But you can see how the water is very muddied when you start incorporating or talking about all the different hormones and all the different functions that they have within the body. Because all of these hormones that kind of we're talking about today, things like cortisol and dopamine and serotonin and GLP-1 and GIP and like all of these different systems and, hormones that are at play here. It's funny that people can come up here and, be overly simplistic or be so reductionist to the point where it's like, oh, we can optimize all of your hormones, when in reality, it's like, no, we need to clarify which ones and how we're going to change them. And to a certain extent, like there's not, unless you're taking these GLP-1 medications and agonists and some of these things, like, yes, there are ways that we can kind of manipulate that through pharmaceutical interventions, even from a diet standpoint as well. But again, I find that when I consume this content, and maybe it's just me being kind of like, uh, I'm not a gatekeeper of information by any means. When I see accounts, when I see coaches, and I see the cortisol mamas out there, and I'm just like, you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. And it's amazing how misleading a lot of these claims and a lot of these things and overly simplistic they're making this out to be, when in reality, there's so many things at play here. And that's unfortunately stuff that doesn't sell though, and the other does. So I'm happy you kind of mentioned that. And even just related to appetite regulation, orexigenic, anorexigenic, like this kind of idea we can kind of come back to, of like what hormones tell us to stop eating and what hormones tell us to eat or continue eating or to keep eating. So thank you for that clarification, because I think that's going to kind of help set the scene for everything else later.
Yeah, I think when thinking about those hormones, we can almost think of it almost like a teeter-totter. So we have a certain amount of anorexigenic and orexigenic hormones being produced throughout the entire day. And that kind of balance of those hormones will dictate, one, if we think about eating more food, and two, how hungry we are. So as most people know, there's different levels to hunger. There's kind of hungry, and then there's ravenous. And again, that balance of those hormones kind of dictates at that immediate point in time what our appetite looks like. And sometimes we might not be super hungry, and this is kind of an important caveat, that we might not be super hungry. So we might have a balance favoring anorexigenic hormones, but we see a food that we really enjoy consuming. We might eat it even in the absence of hunger, or even in the absence of an appetite. Well, let me rephrase that. We have an appetite for that food, but we don't feel hungry in the sense. So kind of that verbiage is kind of tough for some people, but we're not necessarily hungry to eat everything, but we do want that specific food because we know that it's a pleasurable tasting food.
Absolutely, dude. And where does the hypothalamus come into play here in terms of signaling of like, do we need more? Do we need less? Would you say that that is kind of the control center from like an appetite regulation standpoint, or are there other things at play there uh, that can kind of influence what we eat, how much we eat, and our desire to eat on occasion?
Yes, I'll say, I guess when we're thinking about the hormones that are produced in the gastrointestinal tract, a lot of those hormones are binding to receptors inside the hypothalamus. But sometimes it's tough to pinpoint specific parts of the brain because there's receptors all throughout the entire brain. So for me, I try to kind of keep it in the sense that the brain. I just say the brain because pinpointing specific portions of the brain is tough. Um, but there's the receptors that will kind of dictate a lot of our hunger and appetite ends up being inside of the brain. So most of the hormones that we produced inside of the body, so especially inside the gut and inside certain organ systems, bind to receptors in the brain to alter appetite. Um, and then I will say the way that the brain has developed will dictate the specific foods that we desire. So, what foods become top of mind when we're thinking about eating, and then what kind of our connotation towards different foods. Some people find that's why I might like foods that you don't like because of different connotations, the way that our taste buds are set up. So, that's another important caveat. So, that the way that we taste and remember the taste of foods, again, dictates our desire to consume those foods.
Do you, and I actually genuinely don't necessarily know the literature on it, but is there any truth to the fact that, because I've been asked this on a Q&A a handful of times before, where it's like, does the food that you want to eat, uh, does that influence at all come from what your body might be detecting it's sufficient or insufficient in? Meaning like, oh, my attraction to walnuts or Brazil nuts, for example, is because maybe I'm low in selenium and I need more selenium, and my brain knows like there's a lot of things that need to go right for people to actually appreciate the fact that like, eating a Brazil nut is actually high in selenium, and that's a good source of that. But Is there any truth to that? Just a side tangent here of like, yeah, you know what, you need more iron. That's why you're craving red meat, and that's why you want to eat a higher protein meal at this dinner or whatever it might be.
So we'll say what there does seem to be data on is that, let's see. Well, let's say to start with, there are certain truths to that. So specifically for electrolytes and water. So when we're thirsty, foods that have high water content become quite like poignant to us. We want to consume those foods. And then also when we are low in specifically sodium, and it seems like so the body has a very so this is kind of a caveat. We have almost sodium receptors on the tongue we can think of. So we have receptors on the tongue that can pick up that sodium taste. And when we are lower in sodium, those receptors do have feedback loops to increase the amount of sodium that we're consuming. But we don't have receptors like that in the taste buds for all micronutrients. It seems to just be sodium and potentially potassium. That's kind of whether or not that's a little bit of a tricky question. But definitely sodium, we appear to have almost like we can consume sodium and feedback to the brain that we want to consume more of that food. That being said, there doesn't appear to be data that you eat a food that's high in selenium, your brain picks it up and drives you to consume that food again in the future when you're deficient in selenium. But there is some literature that when we are in a state of micronutrient deficiency, when we consume that micronutrient, it becomes more satiating than other foods, in the sense that if we give people that are low in calcium a calcium supplement, it radically reduces their appetite the rest of the day. Or when we give them foods that are higher in calcium, their appetite the rest of the day begins to decrease. So we do see that when we can rectify deficiencies in micronutrients, specifically those micronutrients that can be rectified over the course of days or weeks, those micronutrients, consuming those micronutrients tends to decrease appetite. This isn't necessarily the case for all micronutrients, but we do also know that a diet higher in micronutrients in general has a more appetite suppressive effect, probably because, again, we're rectifying small or minute deficiencies by consuming those micronutrients. But there isn't data to indicate that your body will specifically seek foods or has the ability to know what foods are high in what micronutrients and then consume those foods, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like the classic old example of like, oh yeah, people when they were like coming to America, or like people on ships, and they're deficient in fucking so many nutrients, but they get oranges or they suck on the lemons, or, and they have scurvy, and then all of a sudden like this reverses these symptoms or these micronutrient deficiencies. And like I imagine like people on a ship or coming to a new place or trying these things, just having this instant feeling of relief, and like you said, like kind of satiation to a certain extent, even though they might be malnourished or underweight or overstressed and overworked. But even just the introduction of some of these things that can kind of like cross some more boxes off the list from like what your body needs consistently over time, I imagine your body will just be at a higher operating capacity than having those things be insufficient. And I almost find like for me, you mentioned sodium receptors and kind of like a palate for electrolytes. I find that might maybe be more prevalent and like relevant to people's kind of situations today, and in terms of like we're more likely to be probably dehydrated maybe than anything else, even when we wake up being mildly dehydrated. And I mean, you've seen this take off in the form of like Element ads and Liquid IV and all these electrolyte brands and all this stuff. Like people are kind of marketing on this hydration, and you need more electrolytes, and you need 4 or 5,000 milligrams of sodium every day. But there is truth to some of these things. And I find that, yeah, that appetite for like electrolytes and some of these things is maybe a little bit more prevalent than somebody having scurvy and being vitamin C deficient. So that all checks out to me. The hard part I'm having just like being able to differentiate is like, how much is this like dopamine? And maybe we can describe dopamine and maybe some of these other hormones that we've kind of been talking around. Because when you think about it and it's like, okay, cool. I have a salty, I'm a savory person. And it's like, yeah, maybe you crave more salt. Maybe you need more salt. Maybe you're dehydrated. Maybe you have a, preference for that. But again, going back to today's food environment and to all these tasty foods and all these things we're exposed to, it's like how much of that could be potentially be related to, oh, also craving just this thing that makes us feel comfortable when we're stressed after a long day of work and, we just want to shut down for the day. And like me having, like a thing of French fries or something like that with some salt from Chick-fil-A, like that shit hits. And that's what, makes, so are you craving salt or are you craving some of these other things? Not that we have to answer all these kind of like big questions right now, but like, does dopamine have anything to do with that? Because I think dopamine is a very misunderstood yet commonly used type of like hormone and descriptor when it comes to motivation around eating, and especially in today's food environment. But is dopamine at play here with any of these things? Is that interconnected? And maybe similar to like serotonin or, even cortisol, some of these like big hormones that I think most people might hear or have heard of or might know about. But where does dopamine come into this? And would you say that that has any influence on some of the stuff we're talking about right now?
Yeah, so I'll say that dopamine does tend to kind of be a misunderstood hormone. So we can think almost of dopamine as like the hormone of motivation. So when we see increases in dopamine, that increase in dopamine drives our attention towards a specific goal. So typically, we will have increases in dopamine for very specific things. So when it comes to, we see, let's say we go to Dunkin' Donuts and we see all the donuts that we really like, we will see an increase in dopamine upon seeing the donuts and buying the donuts. And then once we consume those donuts, we see a gradual taper of that dopamine. It still stays elevated and then comes back down to baseline. So dopamine is effectively, we can think of the hormone of motivation, or I guess the neurotransmitter of motivation. So we see increases in dopamine, and that drives us to go seek something. And it's not necessarily just food. It can be things like drugs or specific behavior or things that we enjoy, like reading a book or going to the gym. But I think it's kind of a misunderstood thing that people think that we have, very low dopamine. We consume something that we like, and that increases our dopamine. Whereas typically or technically, it's actually something that will drive us to consume. But that's something that I think people hyper focus, as you said, on specific neurotransmitters or hormones and say this governs all, or look at one thing and miss the entire rest of the picture. So, although it's an important hormone and does play a role in the specific types of foods that we like to consume, it's not necessarily the end all be all, if that makes sense. And there's not much we can do to alter the amount that we produce. There's things that we can effectively, our lifestyle behaviors will dictate when and in what quantity it is produced upon seeing or smelling specific things or thinking about specific things. But there's not a ton that we can do to micromanagement in a sense. When it comes to the thing that you talked about in the terms of salt, or pretty much things that we think about as being tasty, so a lot of those end up being salt and sugar. So we don't see people in their house spoon feeding salt or spoon feeding sugar into their mouth. But we do see people consuming foods that contain sugar or salt and a multitude of other ingredients. So, one thing that we've come to kind of discover or we've come to name in the past few years are hyperpalatable foods. And these are foods that have a mixture of either salt and fat and sugar, or a mixture of all three. So, those three food items tend to make foods more palatable. And when you, even the French fry example is a perfect example. We see that it has higher carbohydrate, higher fat, and higher salt contents. That food becomes hyperpalatable because it has a multitude of things that increase the brain's desire for it. And again, some of that does come down to dopamine and other neurotransmitters that are produced in response to seeing and consuming those foods, especially the way that they hit the taste buds and that they make, I guess, our brain feel in a sense. But there are specific foods that have more or less palatability, which is why, again, a lot of people don't just sit there and eat raw broccoli, but they'll sit there and eat a bucket of French fries. Because, again, those foods have higher palatability ratings we can think of. So, again, people don't go through the supermarket and just put a bunch of bags of sugar in their cart and consume that on a daily basis. But we will consume a lot of things that contain sugar, and sugar is one of the components that makes that food more palatable.
Yes. And hyperpalatability is something I've talked about a lot, but just for clarification on people maybe wondering what that is, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just like something that tastes super delicious, that's really easy to eat and really easy to overeat or overconsume over time. Which again is usually in the form, as you alluded to, of like kind of these, modified or constructed foods in a lab that are designed to look really visually appealing and taste really delicious. And for the most part, be maybe more accessible or more prevalent and maybe at a lower price point compared to, we keep referring to broccoli and some of these other things, but like some of these other like maybe foods that, might come from a farm or might come, a little bit more in their whole form instead of a bunch of ingredients mixed together to essentially designed to taste really delicious in hopes of you coming back to eat them time and time and time again, which is what these companies kind of rely on in their motivation, living in a capitalist kind of society around food and all of this. Again, all these things that drive this environment that we've kind of been referring back to a little bit, why it's very difficult to maybe live in kind of this obesogenic food environment that we live in today. And again, when you have some of these genetic predispositions where it's like, oh yeah, I have more of these, orexigenic, hormones that are constantly, being, released into my body, and I'm always eating, and you have these past experiences, and then you have a food environment that caters to all of these tasty and delicious things that, people want to consume all the time. Like you can start to, paint this picture of like why it's easy for people to overeat. And why that can be a problem for people over time as well.
Yeah, and I think when people think of hyperpalatable foods, a lot of times they think of foods that are, again, constructed in a lab or packaged and processed. They don't necessarily always have to be that way. If we even take that piece of broccoli for an example, if we saute it and cook it the way that we like it, and then we put some salt and some sugar on it, that ends up being a little bit more palatable than just raw broccoli. And that ends up, so again, there's degrees to things. So if we see a mixture of salt, fat, and sugar, that tends to be the most palatable. But we can take things that even at baseline taste okay but not amazing and add in things like salt and sugar, simply just table salt and sugar from a bag, and we can make those things more palatable. So these foods don't necessarily have to be constructed by big food companies or created for you to consume a ton more. They can be things that you create at your house on purpose or on accident.
Let's talk about stress for a second. And I think when people hear the word stress, we've kind of been conditioned to think that like, oh, your cortisol is spiked, and cortisol is a thing that might be driving you to eat more things. Um, what is cortisol's relationship with a lot of stuff that we're talking about today, at least related to appetite regulation? And I ask this knowing that there is a multitude of different answers and different responses that people might experience. For example, like acutely, I know when I'm stressed, I'm not hungry at all. And I can go the whole day without eating. How much I eat at the end of the day when I'm not as stressed or I don't have as many things on my plate is a different story. But um, what is cortisol's relationship with how much we eat, when we eat, how frequently we eat? Is that something that deserves as much attention as people are giving it? And I already know that's a rhetorical question because I posted just recently this last week about cortisol and just shit that pisses me off in this space. And it's like more than ever, I'm seeing these fucking things and these cortisol mamas talking about, do you have a fat face and stubborn belly fat and stinky breath? And, do you have like thinning hair? Do you feel overwhelmed? And are you tired at the end of the day? Just all these vague symptoms that honestly could be anything, but it's just very clear that they are just trying to get a reaction from their audience in order to sell them a grapefruit extract supplement on the back end. So there's obviously differences between that, but like, how can we go about describing what cortisol is, like maybe where it's produced and how that influences our appetite regulation or, what we eat throughout the course of the day?
Yeah, so I think people don't tend to think about it this way, but we can almost think of cortisol as an anti stress hormone. And I say that because cortisol is produced in response to a stressor. But cortisol does a multitude of different things that actually tend to reduce physiological stress on the body. For example, if we take cortisol, cortisol tends to bind to receptors throughout the body and increase the level of blood glucose and blood lipids in the bloodstream. And that blood glucose and those blood lipids can be uptaken by working muscles that are needed in response to whatever the stress is, and they can be uptaken and utilized. So that liberation of those metabolic fuels is actually an anti-stress mechanism. There's a multitude of different things that cortisol does that actually can help in fighting off against stress. But people correlate an increase in stress and an increase in cortisol and think that cortisol itself is causing us to feel stressed or is causing the stress in a sense. But I like to think about cortisol almost as an anti-stress hormone. So if we knocked out the cortisol production, we would have no ability to respond to any stress. The second we met a stressor, we would kind of curl up in a ball and just hide and maybe shake a little bit. So cortisol is effectively an anti-stress hormone. So it does things in response to stress to help us, again, free ourselves of that stress or rid the stress in a sense. So we do know that there's a pathway in producing cortisol. So the production of cortisol starts in the brain with the production of a different molecule called CRH. And we know that that molecule actually has an appetite suppressive effect, which means that in the very beginning stages, when we come face to face with a stressor, our appetite ends up getting suppressed. But we see that cortisol itself sometimes, typically, so it's interesting, certain people have a different response, but the majority of the population sees an increase in appetite in response to cortisol. So that's important. We see that different stages of the stress response tend to dictate or tend to alter appetite differently. So the very initial stage of the stress response, so let's just take kind of everyone's favorite example. You come face to face with a tiger. The first thing you think about isn't going to be eating. Your appetite comes radically suppressed, and that's because the very initial stage is that production of CRH inside the brain. So it's a big thing. But then maybe 5 hours later, once you've freed yourself from running away from that tiger, you might feel ravenous. And a lot of people find that after a very big stressor, they get really hungry later in the day or the next day. And that typically comes from the balance of CRH and cortisol and other hormones. Obviously, we're not thinking about these hormones in just by themselves. There's a multitude of other hormones that have to come into play as well. And the way that cortisol and CRH affect other hormones is important, but we see that that balance of CRH and cortisol tends to go up or down, and that will dictate if we are radically suppressed in appetite or very hungry. So it seems that, again, different stages of the stress response can alter appetite differently, whether or not it's a prolonged stressor or a very acute stressor, things like that. But also, one thing that people don't think about is we can kind of override our hormones based off of what our typical behaviors are. So certain people find that when they were, as they grew up, in response to stress, they didn't eat. Other people found that in response to stress, they ate more. And that can kind of hardwire in our brain so that when we are stressed, we either have that response to not eat or to eat more. And that can kind of override, how much CRH or cortisol we're producing simply because our brain is kind of wired to think about food or not to think about food in those given scenarios. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think that tiger example is so cliche, but it's so relevant and so helpful to drive a point home where it's like, yeah, most people, they aren't fighting a tiger every day, but maybe they're battling a work deadline in the morning, or maybe they're getting their kids fed and out the door and to school before they can start working on their shit throughout the course of the day, right? Or taking care of mom who recently fell and you got to take her to the PT appointments. Like there's a lot of these instances where it's like, yeah, people have this event or this stimulus or this thing that they're prepping for, they're getting ready for. Usually they can foresee it. It's not like, oh, I'm in Africa and I'm getting attacked by a tiger and I have to respond immediately. It's like, yeah, no shit, you're not going to be hungry. But things that I see play out a lot in my practice is exactly what you're alluding to, which is this idea that like maybe you don't feel hungry all the time in the moment. But later on, usually that stress can take people away from eating or maybe make them eat less desirable food or maybe make it more likely for them to stop at Starbucks and get, the scone and the sugary coffee, maybe an egg bite thing, but they're only getting like 8 grams of protein and they think that's a good morning to start their day. Right. It's like maybe the absence of food is what that leads to, or the selection of food that maybe isn't going to take them very far. I usually see a combination of some of those things. And so later in the day, when they get to lunch, like you talked about, or you get to dinner and it's just like, oh, now you have time to think about this. And you realize that you've eaten 600 calories max all day. And you've been chugging caffeine all day. And there's all these other things that are at play here. But it's like, yeah, no shit, you're going to be fucking starving at the end of the day. And I find that even in light of like, hey, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of things in the morning, again, a lot of our mornings start with the night before and sleep and how sleep dysregulation or adequate sleep can also influence a lot of this stuff as well. But you can start to see there's so many points in people's day that can make them more hungry later in the day, even if it's not acute, right? And I think that's the point I think you're trying to drive home is like, yeah, it's stress, acute stress, like in the moment might not be very, you know, appetite increasing, in the moment, but you can see that come a little bit harder later in the day, again, when maybe we haven't eaten enough or have had so many of these events and stressors throughout the course of the day. And then when you do get time to eat, it's there's no confusion around why you might be ravenous or really hard to control yourself, or why the sugary stuff that from Uber Eats and the things that you could just order and don't even have to cook sound more appealing sometimes too.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have that same kind of experience. I didn't eat much today because I was super stressed. Then they get home from a long day and they have time to kind of calm down, effectively de-stress, so reduce the amount of stress that they're under. And then they're like, you know what? I'm really, really hungry. Some of that comes into the fact that you barely ate during the day, and some of that also comes into the fact that we see alterations, and again, that hormonal or neurotransmitter milieu.
Absolutely, dude. And I think I don't know why I'm thinking of it, but I'm thinking of it related to people and clients in my life and stuff that I've seen. But you know, depression and serotonin is a hormone that often comes up in discussion around food and feeling good and influence on what you eat, or how you feel throughout the course of the day, which can also influence how much you eat or what you eat or your inclination to eat. But where does serotonin enter the discussion here? And is that something? And again, maybe I'm bringing this up because I have multiple clients that are on SSRIs, right? And I even myself go through bouts of like seasonal depression, and we all have a lot of stress and a lot of things that is very mentally taxing. And depression, I think, is probably at one of the higher rates that we've ever seen it, and probably continues to trend up, whether it's a diagnostic thing or mental health, and asking for help is being a little bit more common and, understood these days, which I think is a great step in the right direction. But how does serotonin play a role, if at all, in food and how much we eat and all these things? And, is there any relationship between like dopamine and cortisol? I know there is, but like blatant relationship that people can kind of draw on, if they're wondering that for themselves.
Yeah, so I will say that serotonin is kind of a very tricky subject. So there's, I believe, 7 classes of serotonin receptors, and each of those receptors has at least one, if not 2 or 3 subclasses. So the amount of serotonin receptors in the body is higher in magnitude, and each receptor has a different effect. So we know that certain serotonin receptors have appetite suppressing effects, and some have appetite stimulating effects, which is why we see that specific. So we know SSRI is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Um, so we can see that some of these have very specific effects on certain serotonin receptors. And different types of SSRIs will have different effects. So some people, and whether it has to do with the SSRI itself or effectively just their response to this increases in serotonin, we know that they may have different responses to taking an SSRI. They might see an increase in appetite and a decrease in appetite, which is why kind of giving a very blatant what serotonin does to your appetite is very tough. We know that if you put and it also depends on where the serotonin is. If you put a ton of serotonin inside your gastrointestinal tract, you're not going to be very hungry because you're going to be pooping your pants. Because we know that serotonin, what it does is it increases gastric motility. So some people will take tryptophan or serotonin-like supplements orally, and that serotonin, especially if you take like a tryptophan supplement, we see a ton of serotonin being produced in the gastrointestinal tract, and all it really does is make you run to the bathroom later. So we know that where serotonin is important, how much serotonin obviously is important, and the specific serotonin receptors that it's binding to, and two, so I might be born with different quantity of the serotonin receptors. So I might be born with more serotonin 2A, and you might be born with more serotonin type 4 receptors. And again, that has different effects to seeing high levels of serotonin in the body. And throughout the years, again, epigenetically, we talked about, so starting from when you're inside your mother's womb and throughout all of your developmental years, and again, effectively throughout your entire life, we see alterations in the amount of serotonin receptors we have and where those receptors are located throughout the brain. So I'll say that my response to having a higher level of serotonin inside my brain might be radically different than your response to having a higher level of serotonin. So certain people have different responses to SSRIs or things that we know increase serotonin levels. So that's kind of a very important caveat, is that people are very different in the sense that how they respond specifically to this hormone, most hormones in general, but very specifically to serotonin.
Yeah, dude. Well said. Well said. And I'm happy you bring up the digestive piece or even just like tryptophan, for example, because I've seen that a lot in my practice too, where people will quote unquote do their own research. And it's like, oh, I found that serotonin is important for how I feel, and tryptophan is an essential amino acid, and it's a precursor for serotonin. Therefore, I could supplement with tryptophan or eat way more foods of these, or way more foods that have tryptophan in it. And that is going to be something that makes me happy, right? And like you said, you alluded to, it's like, oh yeah, you take that, and all you're going to be doing is running to the bathroom probably more frequently than actually seeing, substantial improvements. Yes, like getting enough protein and getting enough tryptophan and all these other essential amino acids are important, but you'll hear and see, I've seen it a lot where it's like 80-90% of serotonin is produced in your gut, but uh this idea that, yeah, that's still separate than maybe what's going on in our brain, or like you alluded to, there's all these different receptors, and it's not as simple as like, oh yeah, if we can just get more serotonin in our gut. And not to mention, the whole gut uh brain barrier, or the blood brain barrier, and kind of how that's related to here, and how these different organs, yeah, it might all be connected within your body, but maybe there's different systems at play here, and one isn't always directly going to be influencing the other, for example.
Yeah, the amount of serotonin in your gut doesn't necessarily it. So there are like specific like nerves that innervate from the gut to the brain, and sometimes we see that there are serotonin receptors on those nerves, and increases in serotonin in the gastrointestinal tract can increase serotonin in the brain. But this isn't a uniform finding. So it also depends on what species we're studying. It's very hard to study this in humans, the type of study we're doing. So we don't necessarily know if increasing gastrointestinal serotonin has any effect on increasing brain serotonin. We think it might have an effect. The magnitude of that effect isn't very clear either, but we're not even sure if that effect is 100% there. And again, it might be different for different people.
Absolutely, dude. Yeah. And just one more thing on this whole conversation, because again, like depression and depressive symptoms, and pharmaceutical interventions related to the treatment of depression, I think is becoming more common now. And honestly, I like to see it. I've seen it do wonders for people. And I've also see people use them temporarily and then come off of it and kind of live, not happily ever after, but see a lot of benefits from that too. But I have two clients in particular, and I want to just talk about weight gain and weight loss for a second, because I've personally found it interesting, where I have a lady who, again, maybe goes through once or twice a year. Well, she'll go on levodopa, or not levodopa, it's a Parkinson's medication, Lexapro, um, just taking an SSRI in general, though, and seeing her weight decrease a little bit. I've found this really fascinating. I've had another person who started Lexapro and continued to take it, and they gained 15 pounds. The first one I mentioned is a girl, but the SSRIs, it's not necessarily that they have like a direct impact on energy balance, correct? It's more of like, at least what I've seen in practice is like, hey, if we can get people's brain chemistry evened out a little bit more and get them to a place where, this one lady, where it's like there's more inclination to get up and go to the gym 3-4 times a week and do her normal programming. And she's, subconsciously her movement increases substantially because she's more inclined to go for a walk after work, and to take the dogs out multiple times a day, and to say yes to go paddleboarding with friends on the weekend, and to go golfing with her boyfriend on occasion. Like, it's almost like those things are easier, so her activity increases. But sometimes you would think that, oh yeah, you're depressed, you're not eating a ton, therefore, when you start feeling better, you maybe start eating more, and that's when you see some of this weight gain start to happen, where that is the case for another person as well. But is that something that we kind of see in literature as well, where it's like, hey, the weight gain, weight loss discussion? Because I think that's a real concern that a lot of people have. And those are both conversations that I've had with these people before they even started the medication. And my response is like, I plead the fifth, bro. I have no idea how you're going to respond to some of these things. But do we see some of these weight fluctuations with these kind of antidepressant medications? Is it from a direct kind of like mechanism, or is it more indirect kind of factors that can kind of influence some of these things? And again, you might just say, yeah, we have fucking all these different receptors, and who the fuck knows? But what do we kind of see for people in those situations if they're wondering what's going to happen to them if that's something that they take?
Yeah, I'd say in the same way that people see different responses to depressive episodes, some people see weight loss and some people see weight gain.
Yep.
Down to kind of our responses in the past and kind of the way that our brain becomes wired based off of the way that we were raised. But I will say that we don't see that serotonin binds to a receptor and increases the metabolic rate of that specific cell, or it doesn't increase thyroid at all, and it might actually have a mild decreasing effect on thyroid. We're not entirely certain about that. But yeah, I think kind of as you said, certain people will have different responses to increases in serotonin. And for some people, feeling good looks like going out and going out to the bar with your friends and drinking a lot more, or going out and doing things that aren't necessarily physical activities. And some people feeling good means that because of and a lot of this people don't think about comes down to the people in your surroundings. If you're more excited to go hang out with your friends, and one person has friends that say, hey, let's go on a hike, and another person has friends that say, hey, let's go to the bar and get blackout drunk. Like there's differences there specifically in just your environment. So they might both see the same increases in energy or what they, going out with friends, their likelihood to go out with friends. But the specific things that they're engaging in might be radically different, and that might dictate the weight gain or weight loss. Or for me, if I was super energetic, again, I'd probably want to go to the gym, or I might invite people on a hike. But other people, if they're super energetic, that's their, thing. Like their thing is going out and going to the club, which isn't a bad thing. But again, it's different proclivities towards different activities. Um, and some people find that they do eat more or less on SSRIs. So that's, again, very specific on certain people find that when they feel good, they tend to eat less because their mind is very focused on engaging in activities that make them feel good rather than engaging in behaviors that have to do with foods in a sense. Um, so that's kind of, again, something that's set up from kind of from birth. When you're energetic, what things you like to engage in. So I'd say that it might not necessarily be down to the fact that one person is more or less hungry, but it's the fact that one person decides to engage in different activities than one or another. And the hunger or the propensity of different serotonin receptors might also play into, again, small alterations in appetite. But I think the big levers would end up being what things people end up engaging in.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, well said. Again, it goes back to the environment as well and the people you surround yourself with and who's part of your closest circle and what are the behaviors you do start to engage in after, maybe you start to feel a little bit better. You see some of the positive effects of some of these medications, and how they take effect on you and your body. So really well said, dude. I'm I'm looking at the rest of my topic list and we only have like, 10, 15 minutes here. I'm uh I'm leaning more towards like, hey, let's talk about a little bit more gut related hormones. Maybe we can touch on some of these really popular medications that exist on the market today: Ozempic, Wegovy, tirzepatide, just these GLP-1, GIP medications. But I think it could be helpful to talk about, what are some of these other hormones, that are produced in the gut or related to our gut that influence how much or how little we eat. And the ones that I'm thinking about out loud are leptin. I guess we can talk about ghrelin in relationship to that as well, but leptin is the one I'm really fascinated with. And then GLP, GIP, PPY. I've maybe just sticking to some of these GLP, GIP is probably the two more commonly commonly known hormones these days. But can we talk about just kind of maybe from leptin and then going all the way down the digestive tract and talking about some of these other kind of appetite suppressing hormones? How can we go about conceptualizing like how those help people eat less over time and maybe why, if the lack of presence in them or, if they are not as high as maybe compared to somebody with the same genetics and everything else, but their hormone response after these meals is a little bit higher, maybe their nutrition related stuff is a little bit higher, how maybe that can keep them from eating more over time, independent of weight loss medications. But how can we kind of describe what leptin is and kind of just go down the chain from there?
Yeah. So I'll say people tend to group leptin and ghrelin in together. So leptin is a hormone produced by our fat cells, and it's produced in proportion to how much fat is inside of that fat cell. So the larger a fat cell gets, the more leptin it produces. And that's important because leptin, we know, has an appetite suppressive effect in the brain. But people would hear this. So when we're at very low levels of body fat, we tend to have a higher appetite because our fat cells aren't producing as much leptin because they're not as large. So we see lower levels of leptin and higher appetite levels. And as we begin to gain weight back to around a healthy level of body fat, so let's say someone at 5% body fat will be more hungry than that same person at 10% body fat, because those fat cells aren't signaling to the brain that we have fat on the body, so we'll try to eat more food. But we see that, at 10 to 15, or probably all the way up to 25 or 30% body fat, the more fat that we have, the lower our appetite gets. But I say up to 25 or 30% body fat because we see that as body fat increases high enough, the amount of leptin that we're producing supersedes the brain's ability to cope, we can say. And we see that excess leptin inside the brain causes what is referred to as leptin resistance, or the fact that the brain is not responding the same way to that leptin. So we see that people who are obese tend to actually have higher appetites than they would have at 25 or 30% body fat, simply because their brain is becoming resistant to that leptin production. So the receptors in the brain that leptin would bind to and activate are no longer functioning properly. Or we might, in certain circumstances, the amount of those receptors will begin to become reduced when people get to very high levels of body fat. With that, there's also a genetic component. I might be born with more or less leptin receptors than you. I also might be born with fat cells that produce more or less leptin at a given level of fat. So that's very important that genetic components play a part in that. But me at the same genetics at 5% body fat, 10% body fat, and 50% body fat will have different responses to the amount of leptin being produced inside my body, and will produce different amounts of leptin. But we can think of leptin for most people as an appetite suppressive hormone until we get to excess levels of body fat, where that leptin system becomes dysregulated in a sense, and we are no longer sensing. Effectively, it's like our brain can no longer sense that we have excess body fat. When we think about ghrelin, because those two tend to get lumped together, ghrelin is produced by the gastrointestinal tract. Ghrelin is produced when the gastrointestinal tract is empty, and ghrelin production is reduced when gastrointestinal tract is full. So we see that if I haven't eaten in 12 to 15 hours, my ghrelin production is going to increase. If I ate an hour ago, I'll have lower levels of ghrelin than, again, if I've been fasting for 12 to 15 hours. So those two hormones tend to get lumped together. I'm not certain why, but kind of maybe, actually, I'm not sure why they get lumped together, but those were kind of the two main ones, I think, maybe 10 to 15 years ago. So that might be why they were kind of the first few that were discovered. And we're now discovering more hormones produced inside the gastrointestinal tract specifically, mainly the small intestine and the large intestine. So what you talked about, the main ones that are becoming very popular right now are GLP-1 and GIP, kind of as a result of GLP-1 getting popular. So I'll say GIP and GLP-1 typically will almost always get produced together. So the cells that produce GIP are typically more concentrated in the upper levels of the intestinal tract, which is the small intestine. And the cells that produce GLP-1 are typically located lower down in the gastrointestinal tract, typically in the very lowest portion of the small intestine and the upper portion of the large intestine. The reason why this is important is because the way that we produce these molecules is by interacting with food. So food components, specifically glucose, amino acids, and specific fatty acids, will bind to and interact with the cells that produce GIP and GLP-1. And when those food molecules interact with those cells, it increases the production of GIP and GLP-1. But as I mentioned, GIP, the cells that produce it are located higher up in the intestinal tract. And for GLP-1, the cells that produce it are located lower down in the intestinal tract, which means that digestive efficiency of foods is important. Foods that are digested very rapidly, such as juices, simple sugars, or foods that are almost pre-digested for us, don't make it very far down in the gastrointestinal tract. So we see that they induce a lower level of GLP-1 production and a higher level of GIP production. But foods that are more complex and harder to digest, such as complex carbohydrates or very fibrous vegetables, will make it down, those food molecules will make it down farther down in the intestinal tract and increase GLP-1 more than their counterparts, which don't have complex structures inside of them. And this is important because GLP-1 has a much stronger appetite suppressing effect than GIP. It also has a much stronger blood glucose regulating effect than GIP. So we see that GLP-1, so we'll say GLP-1 medications, the most popular ones right now are Ozempic and Wegovy. They basically bind to the GLP-1 receptor, the same receptor that the GLP-1 produced in our gastrointestinal tract would bind to. And those medications were kind of created for improving blood glucose, because we know that GLP-1 has a very strong blood glucose regulating effect or reducing effect for those who are diabetics. So we see that GLP-1 is much stronger than GIP when it comes to regulating blood glucose. So foods that have higher GLP-1 responses compared to GIP responses tend to be more appetite suppressing and tend to have better effects on blood glucose levels, which is pretty much just important for those diabetic people. So I'll say that foods that are more difficult to digest typically have the greatest effect on appetite suppression. That was a lot of info. I'm sorry.
No, it was great. It was great. And I'm happy you kind of linked them all together and kind of talked about the relationship with one another. Cause again, they're all happening at once. It's not like, oh, you have more leptin right now. And that's the thing that's just, making everything better. Or, oh, you have, this GLP-1 agonist medication that you're taking, and therefore everything else is shut off. And that's the only mechanism that's making everything good. It's everything is at play here. And I want to talk about leptin for a second. Or I have one more follow-up question, maybe about GLP-1 medication stuff. But I remember, when I was getting, it was probably 2014, 15 when I was getting into nutrition, learning about obesity. That's, kind of what you're taught a little bit in school and kind of seeing interventions. And, when you're introduced to like nutrition research and then you start reading nutrition research articles, I remember early on reading about clinical trials related to leptin and like leptin injections. And that almost at the time or in the early 2000s, feeling like that was what the GLP-1 medications are today, where it's like, hey, yeah, we found this hormone that can kind of make people more satiated or not eat as much. And we'll just like inject people with that. And, that will kind of fix our problem and help people lose weight or not overeat and blah, blah, blah. So I found that to be fascinating and I'm happy you bring up leptin resistance because, we just don't see that. We don't see that play out. And theoretically on paper, it's like, oh yeah, the people who are the heaviest have the highest leptin levels. And why are they still eating more? Why are they still having a difficult time regulating their appetite? If that's an issue that they're dealing with. And I found that to be very interesting. And that's when I think of like nutrition research and why it's so important and how we get to where we are today. And we look at the efficacy and the safety and a lot of these medications that we have today. It's like, it's because of these trials and these things that happened a long time ago that led us to the place that we are today. And now we've found these GLP-1 agonists and they're doing wonders for people. And they are so important for the people that need them. And we're seeing them just do such a good job, and will likely be the improvement at a public health level that we need to see some of these things go down in the future. That's at least my take on it. But I'm happy you mentioned the leptin resistance because I found that interesting. And I don't know, I think of like insulin resistance. You think of leptin resistance. For me, I feel like there's so many things when somebody is obese or overweight or they have excess, adiposity and a high percent of visceral fat and, they're just metabolically unhealthy. Like would you agree that it's more of like, a metabolic type of syndrome than it is, oh, leptin resistance is this one thing that's, making it harder for people who might be overweight to control their appetite. Because you see leptin resistance happen with insulin resistance, and those are the same people whose liver enzymes might be elevated as well. They have high blood pressure or, like just being metabolically unfit. I feel like I would classify this leptin resistance in. Would you agree with that? Or is there something independent of that is worth acknowledging?
No, I have to agree. I think one of the most important levers that we can pull for improving everything, almost pretty much everything, is if you are overweight, reducing body fat. There's so much, there are so many effects that excess body fat has that we don't even think about might coincide with one another. So just reducing body fat is probably the most important lever people can pull if they are overweight for improving pretty much all facets of their health. And kind of the things that we think about, like high blood pressure, high blood glucose, a lot of those diseases are a consequence of high body fat. So it's not necessarily like we have high blood glucose and then we get overweight. Typically, it's we get overweight, which causes the high blood glucose, or we get overweight, which causes the cardiovascular complications. So, in the absence of things like smoking and things that we know that have detrimental effects on health, like a lot of the things that we think about as like the major killers all come from having excess levels of body fat. Whether or not you have it now, It could be from, you had excess body fat for 40 years, and then you might still be seeing some of the effects of that. So a lot of times people think, oh, here's this one lever that we can pull and it will fix this entire syndrome in and of itself. If that lever doesn't reduce body fat, there's still other things that are kind of coming to consequence or causing that consequence in a sense. So I think body fat is, as much as it's unsexy, it's not a single hormone that's going to fix everything or a single thing that's going to fix everything. Getting to a healthy body weight is probably one of the most important things that anyone can do to improve their health.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, how dare you bring up weight, right? But that's a reality that we live in, right? And it's something that, even if it's not everybody getting back down to a quote unquote ideal body weight, even if it's a 5 to 10% reduction in body weight, we can see massive improvements in health outcomes and, like insulin sensitivity and, your blood markers and your lipid panel. Like there's so many things that you could see benefit from that. Um, and again, it a lot of times just having too much extra body weight is not a good thing for health over the long run. And so last thing I want to just kind of bring up here, I know you got to go here in a few minutes, is just alluding, because I think we've done a good job talking about a lot of things today, but when it comes to like practical applications of stuff, like, we've talked around things, but I want to just hone in on this whole topic where it's like exercise is good. Maybe managing your energy balance or losing weight if you need to could be good for people. Um, but also from a diet related standpoint, nutrition related standpoint, independent of your environment, independent of your genetics, independent of what your leptin is, and what all these things that we talked about today are. There are things that we could do to be more advantageous than less advantageous. And when I say that, and what you alluded to earlier is like, yeah, high fiber diet or eating more fiber is probably a good thing for people, especially people who can tolerate it. You have a situation where, yeah, there's clinical considerations and a diagnosis where maybe you can't eat certain types of fiber, but maybe you can eat others. And if we can get away with that and do that, that's probably better for people's health. For the general public listening to this, it's like, yeah, if you don't have any food intolerances and you feel decent and like eating enough fiber, something that, again, when we look at like GLP-1 and satiety benefits, like having more fiber going through the digestive tract and, quote unquote, like turning on GLP-1 a little bit more, GIP a little bit more than other foods, probably another, drop in the bucket of benefits when it comes to fiber consumption. Same with like higher protein diets, to a certain extent. But take home message here is like, yeah, maybe more whole, maybe more nutrient dense foods, maybe higher protein sources. These are probably things that, again, are going to keep you fuller for longer, more satiated, can kind of act on some of these hormones to just, again, work in your favor instead of somebody sitting here who is eating predominantly ultra processed, hyper palatable foods where maybe you're not getting that same benefit of a satiety benefit. And you have all these genetic components that might be working against somebody in addition to that and make it very difficult to control how much they're eating over time. So I find that that's something that I just really wanted to help people appreciate, independent of whether or not you're taking Ozempic or not. Like eating some of these more whole nutrient dense foods is still going to be in your best interest.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I think people think that two things cannot also like occur at the same time. Like, you can be taking, a medication and you can also be improving your dietary habits, or you can be adding an exercise and also improving your dietary habits. So you could do. There's a multitude of mechanisms that we can pull simultaneously that can all contribute to a greater weight loss. So I think, and we don't always have to pull every lever at one time. That's another thing is just because you're not, exercising doesn't mean you can't improve your nutrition. I've heard a lot of people say, I can't, I haven't changed my diet yet because I haven't started exercising, which kind of doesn't make much sense to me because we can get started, improving our body composition, improving our health without exercise by improving just our diet. And then we can put in exercise and have two things that coincide with one another. So we can do multiple things that all contribute to a greater good in a sense. But it ends up being, yeah, I think dietary strategies end up being some of the biggest, if not the biggest levers.
Agreed, dude. Yeah, really well said. This was really informative. And again, I'm laughing because I'm looking at my notes list, and man, we didn't talk about half the things that I, you know, I think we could have talked about as well, insulin, ketosis, different gut, kind of hormones, exercise, sleep, all this stuff that can kind of influence. But I think what we got has been super helpful. And maybe we'll bookmark a part two for the future at some point. But tell the people where they can find you, where they can learn more about you, where they can learn from you. I got to say, from my standpoint, if you are interested in learning about these topics, or you're a coach or you're a dietitian or a healthcare provider, like subscribing to Alan Aragon's research review is something that's helped me tremendously with my continuing education. Not that I get units for it, but just being immersed in up-to-date research and, being introduced to people like you and reading about articles related to things that, I've kind of forgot about since going to school. So I would highly recommend that. I know they can find you in some of your articles there, but tell the people where they can find you, how they can get a hold of you, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So all my social medias are, you can look up Calvin Scheller. Scheller is spelled Scheller. So you look up that name and you should find me. On Instagram, my business, or the nutrition account, is Calvin_Scheller. And if for some reason you're interested in things that I do in my daily life, I do have a personal account. It's Calvin.Scheller. So that there's no nutrition stuff. Well, there's little to no nutrition stuff there. And it's a lot of just kind of, I guess, me goofing around in the new house. It's, I'm a teenager living by myself. It's it's always interesting. Um, and then TikTok is physiology with Calvin. And then I'd say, to find some of the articles that I've written, your best bet would be Alan's research review. Subscribe there. There should be 7 or 8 in there that I've contributed to him, and obviously read all the other amazing articles in there. And then if you look my name up on YouTube, you should be able to find this podcast and all the other podcasts I've been on.
Thank you, bro. Appreciate it. You're a good follow too. Big shout out to you, man.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.